make sure from my phone that it goes live. Probably. Maybe.
It says it's live.
There's a delay, so you all just watched us do that. But hello, I am Asia from Flexy, and this is Mallory with Flexy, and we are so excited to host Be the Good virtually for you today, a diversity and inclusion event. So Mallory's going to tell you a little bit more about that now.
Yes. Well, again, as she said, we're so excited to do this with you guys because honestly, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, we're kind of just dipping our toes, especially in our general area. So it's so important to focus on really solid leaders who know what they're talking about and can really help guide us in the transition of making our community better. So that's why we've reached out to Kiona and Nicole of the Roundtable to really help lead us in this quest to make diversity and inclusion more accessible and more of a reality in Kansas City. So Kiona and Nicole, I'm going to go ahead and just kick it straight off to you since we're only here for an hour and tell them a little bit more about the Roundtable, and then you can just go straight into it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mallory. Thanks for having us. And I'll let Nicole talk about the Roundtable and start us off.
Okay, thank you. It's so great to be here. Thank you, Flexy, for having us. And for those of you who are able to join us today, and some of you who may have joined us a couple weeks ago, we are excited. And as they mentioned, we're the Roundtable, and you've seen probably Kiona doing her individual work and mine as well. And what we've done is we've linked arms. And we want to just cultivate these crucial community conversations and convene in spaces so that we can talk about the topics that we know are most important in Kansas City. With our approach, we focus so much on diversity, equity, inclusion as Black women, different generations, right? Kiona's half my age, but different generations, different lived experiences, different personal narratives, but we definitely have a shared view of what we want for our community. And we know that that begins with relationships, learning from each other, and these crucial conversations. So that's how the Roundtables come together. You may have not seen us in a while because we usually convene in person. We think it's powerful to build those relationships, but we also know engaging virtually and being able to spread this message and catching you where you are is very important. So I'll let Kiona kind of pick up from there as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, exactly. We're really excited to be here. Thanks to Asia and Mallory for extending the invitation with Flexy to have this conversation, which Mallory alluded to earlier. We're just at the very beginning of what many people should continue to talk about and elevate in our communities, the importance of not just diversity, but equity and making changes and building those relationships that ultimately cultivate community in its entirety. And so today we wanted to kick off just a short few slides for Be the Good virtually for those who joined us and for you all who made the effort to be in this space with us. And as Nicole mentioned, the Roundtable, we started at this point, I think 2 years ago. And with the Men's Roundtable, really elevating with the purpose to convene men around critical community conversations with elevating women and what that looks like in our everyday spaces. And we thought that would be one event. We're done. And it turned into more needs, more anecdotes of shared lived experiences, coffee meetings, other relationships were born from just that very one event. And Nicole and I saw immediately a need to continue to have these critical community conversations that we call the Roundtable jointly together. And it has been nothing but amazing. And it's been incredible to give us opportunities like today to continue to grow together and elevate this brand under our names. And so we're excited to be here, and I wanted to kick it off to Nicole because we kind of opened up right in person with this event and really started talking a lot about what a year it has been. And there are so many people who are looking now in their spaces, in their families, at their dinner tables, in their workspaces, or in their virtual screens. And a lot has changed since 2019 and the catalyst of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I wanted to kind of just ask you, right, like just to kind of kick this off from the beginning stages of what comes to mind. I mean, we've had together, right? Like I know so many common people that we know or don't know ask us, what are the next steps, right? Because so much has changed, but wanted to kind of open up that dialogue and kind of get feedback from you just about immediate thoughts and just kind of what brought us to this point and why it's important now to be more intentional with these conversations, and then white allyship as well.
That's so great. Thank you so much for giving the history and jumping it off, Kiona. This is just a joy for us to share space together. And every time we do, it just gets better and better. So I'm excited for today. The Roundtable, we started before the incidents of 2020, and we didn't know that the conversations that we started then would be just even more and more pressing and pertinent during this time, right? And so what's so interesting, we say, what a year. And I'm struck with, gosh, what a life, because I had a milestone birthday. I turned 50 in 2020. And what I really realized is in the 1800s, 1860s, we had Juneteenth, we had our emancipation. Then in the 1960s, it's the civil rights movement. And here we are 50 years later, right? And we're talking about the incidents that happened in 2020, least of which, of course, George Floyd's murder. And so when I think about the totality of my life, we've been talking about these topics, my parents, my grandparents, my great grandparents before us, and then therefore, why now? And it took this moment of awakening, this reckoning, for us to take conversations that were happening in pockets, but to build this momentum and this shared drive to say no more. We can't persist in this state. And so what I think is so great about the next step is I know that there's more people in my sphere of influence, I should say, that are really inclined to make change and live anti-racist work, but they don't know where to start. And so what I've largely seen is that we are still in segregated communities. So if Black people and white people and other communities of color aren't communicating and talking, there's assumptions, biases, and analysis paralysis that persists. And in that state, we have not made change. And so we looked 20 years ago, I worked in the not-for-profit sector. 20 years ago, we said we wanted to diversify the field. And 20 years later, it looks very similar to what it did. And so we're saying, what can we do intentionally now and make action? So that's what I think the catalyst is. And it's beyond statements, it's beyond words, it's beyond intention, it's the focus on action.
Absolutely. And pivoting to, obviously, this summer, George Floyd happens, and our country, for the first time probably ever across the United States, are at a moment where we can't go to work, simultaneously with now forced to have these conversations at the dinner table with our and look inwardly at our lives and kind of look our faces in the mirror and really starting to understand we can't no longer separate the two, because who we are in our workspaces reflect how we outwardly display equity in our actions in our personal lives as well. And so I think for me, and just kind of hearing you, right, because again, we're two different ages, two different generations. And when I hear you talk about, what a year, but no, what a life, it's very true, because I can't even fathom, this symbolic alignment with what happened then versus what's happening now. And for me, it's like, well, a whole lot like then is starting to look a whole lot like now. And it's been this kind of awakening and opening moment for everyone to kind of elevate and really just start to take in what we all have known as Black people and people of color in America, LGBTQ community, so forth, and the list goes on, about these conversations and things that we've been having for quite some time.
So true. And what we haven't done is we have started conversations, we've dipped our toe in, but we haven't had the real conversation. We haven't gone head first in there, partially because I think we wanted to ignore the fact that who we say we are as a nation in terms of united we stand and all of that, and equity for all versus how we live out in our day to day. There's a big gap and discrepancy. I don't think we wanted to really look that in the face, because then we would have to say we're different than who we say we are. And so I think there's some of that that's persisted. Also, we have to look at the systems that have perpetuated the oppression within our communities. And that too, as people, as leaders, it's this fear that if we kind of pull the onion back we're going to pull back all the layers. And I think some people have built their foundation on some of these beliefs and thinking we're going to shake ourselves at our core instead of thinking that we can really go deep and dig in there and figure out what's going on and make policy changes that lead to practice changes. That can only happen when you go deep. When we skim the surface, we're living a falsehood and we're living a lie, really, instead of just having that reckoning or that awakening. I think that's so much of what's happened and persisted over generations. Not to mention, keeping things the way they are benefits some people. So keeping the status quo as it has, there's been people who, they say, oh my gosh, remember when? And they speak with wistfulness and celebration because it was a time when their community could have prosperity, but that prosperity was not for all. And so we're seeing that in much different ways at this time.
Right. And acknowledging that prosperity for all doesn't still take away from the suppression and the things that are still current every single day, but in actuality gives us an opportunity to sympathize and empathize with people of color, to see the everyday lived experiences and really how we can make things better. Because we know even just your bottom line, right? Retention, recruitment, when we're intentional about all those everyday things that you do so well every day in your coaching with Connection Coach KC, those things play a part into impacting businesses, and we start bottom lines impact, so forth and so forth. And so there's not just the, the prosperity for all, we know it's not. But to your point, Nicole, just understanding too that there is still this space of, I'm not trying to make my white brothers and sisters feel bad, right? But there is just this realization that because the color of your skin, you've been afforded, I think people don't even really understand the opportunities that are there because they have not, some of them have yet to see. But come live 24, 48 hours in my shoes. And I think people have a different perspective for sure.
That is so true. And I give an example because we called it white privilege. And then some people associate privilege with affluence and have said, oh, but I'm not affluent, or it doesn't mean that I had an easy life. So white advantage, right? And the story that brings that home to me, I have a friend whose husband is a police officer, and they're a white couple, and he drives an unmarked police car typically. And he was driving her car, and we were all riding together somewhere, and he looked around, and people were driving as we see them driving without using their signal, running through lights, doing all the things that we see happen. He's like, is this how people drive? He was so taken aback. And we said, yeah, you just don't see it because you drive an unmarked police car. So when people see your car, they slow down and follow all the rules. He had privilege in that space that he didn't even realize. And especially it goes so much deeper being a police officer, but he looked around and it was a whole new world. And I think that's what really happens is when you're in this state of privilege or advantage, you can't see that it's different for other people. And he had that example that brought it home. And then I took it a little bit further and then related it to race in that instance. But that is what happens. And I love that statement that for those of privilege, equality can feel like oppression. Because someone who's in privilege, who's used to always having that advantage, when things shift to a more equitable space, it can feel like they're losing ground and they can feel like they're oppressed, when really we know that there is enough resources and abundance in our world for prosperity to happen for all. It doesn't mean that one group can have prosperity and that means that you're going to have less. It means that we can together have prosperity, and how much further we can have an innovation, how much further we can bring our country together and all the goals that we have. So I thought that's the thing that comes to my mind so often.
Yeah, so we fast forward right to white allyship and diving after George Floyd and start looking at some of these like tangible action items. And we always, me and you, talk about PR to practice, right? Number one. And for me, right, what that displays, or from our perspective, is basically moving from transactional change to transformational change. And so I think for us, we've always kind of had these back and forths on, we've seen the statements, we've seen things that have been elevated. We've come to terms that we agree, like this is a problem, but now implementing the long lasting systemic equity change and implementing those things that need to happen from small to big measures to everyday practice in our lives that ultimately gives, right, the change from a status quo to, okay, now things are starting to open up for people of color in everyday spaces. And so what do you feel, or how do you feel where we are now? Because I know we talked about this in person for the Be the Good event with Flexy, but now with PR to Practice, it's kind of this stagnant. I feel like it's a balance because we understand, but some of us are kind of reverting back, right, to our old ways. So how do we get out of that rut and just really start to not get complacent? To say, oh, George Floyd, we celebrated the year anniversary, Juneteenth became a federal holiday. Our company's doing great. I don't know. We'll see.
I love everything you said, because complacency is just the enemy of progress. When we become, and our default is, I want to be comfortable, I want to feel good, I want to sigh. And when we sit in the discomfort, our first inclination is to get out of it as quickly as we can. And I think that's where we fall back to our default of everything's fine, you're right, and go to just some key landmarks and then just milestones and speak to those, and not the totality. Like Juneteenth is a national holiday, but do some of the policies that persist still exist? Absolutely.
Yeah.
The policies that keep marginalized communities from achieving their goals and prospering? Absolutely. So that while that is an important piece, the totality of it is not reached. And so what I really see with PR to Practice is, when those statements came out, specifically, there's been many times, but never as many as after George Floyd's death, we all saw them. At first, it feels good as a person of color because you're like, oh, it's spoken into the space, right?
Absolutely.
Because there's been so much avoidance and neglect and ignoring that there's times when it wasn't the pandemic, I would go to work and I would hear people talking about the show they watched last night or the vacation they're going on. And I wanted to say, don't you know someone was just murdered?
Right.
No, like, are you not talking about that? It just gets in your heart. Not that we can't, that's all we have to talk about, but for seemingly people to be living their lives joyfully when
Right.
there's a community in mourning was just so painful. So to hear the acknowledgement, but that's like, if we say 101, that's at like 95 to me, the acknowledgement. Right. And then I've worked at companies where I know that those statements aren't coming as much from the heart as they are from a legal and a sculpted and a crafted in a strategic way. So do we always want to put our best communication forward so that we're speaking in the best communication ways? Absolutely. You want communication specialists too, but are you doing that so that your company looks good? Or are you doing it because you truly want to make progress and honor the people that are part of your staff? Did you make a statement but then not say anything to anybody in person or the people that you work with? Those are the questions that come to my mind. So the PR is one thing, but the practice is where the rubber hits the road, and that's where you see the differences. And I did see some organizations, I've talked about this, I saw people, my inbox has never been more full. People were scrambling, and that also was challenging. And Kiona, you know this, because some of those same people who scrambled to get us after George Floyd died were the same 6 months earlier that poo-pooed what we were doing and said that they were good. So I think the thing to keep us from being complacent is knowing that DEI is not a destination, but it's an ongoing process and maturation and learning that we go through. It isn't that one day all of a sudden you say, we've arrived, we are diverse, we're equitable, but that we have to constantly build, move, reassess, pivot, all of those things, and that we won't, in my lifetime, nor in Rowan's, reach where we can say truly, equity for all. It's an ongoing process.
No, you just dropped a whole bunch of stuff. I don't even want to conclude after that. It's kind of like, let's just go to the next slide.
Well, honestly, it's for the audience to know, and thank you, Mel. I saw that wow on there. We talk about this all the time. So I may have said some things, but there are pieces of things that I've gotten from you that we've spoken about in dialogue because we know this to be true.
Absolutely. I'm just still thinking about the poo-poo and the not call it back. But, it's kind of, I think, refreshing for me, right? Because now when we talk about white allyship, and it's actually, more than just like how we talked about in How to Be an Anti-Racist, Kendi's book, and then of course, Right for Julie with Robin, and how she's giving, tangible resources and kind of just that inward look about the white experience. Because even me and you don't even know what that's like as being two Black women. So, internalizing that, but also how this is not like a sad, somber, woe is me, I'm not, I don't feel equipped. You actually, if you flip that, right, there are tangible steps, right, in white allyship and unification that we talk about all the time that allows you to occupy space for you to feel comfortable, for you to have, the tools in your mental and in your space that you're in to accelerate, right, on behalf of these things, to your point, that we've been facilitating and talking about for months. And when I think of white allyship, I think about a lot of people in our spaces that we know commonly who have sent the email, right? Who have spoken in absence of, who have advocated for at the table, because every seat at the table, the voices are never, sometimes not heard, even though the seat is open and the seat is occupied. And so some of those real tangible things, because I know you get more of this than I do. I know you probably disagree, but there's a lot of, right now where we have these decision makers, right? So for example, board of directors and so forth who occupy these spaces, and we see how much power and privilege and decision making that is taking place that affects organizations, HR, implementation, retention, recruitment, from who's hired. It's like, that is overwhelming, and I need a whole minute.
You've done so much in this space too, Kiona. Kiona led a whole session just for white allies. It was like a series that was sold out and people loved because she was talking authentically. And that's what I think people don't realize, is that these conversations that Kiona and I are having have been held in communities of color, but it has only been within the last year for me that I've spoken in such a direct and specific way. So some of my defaults have been in terms of complacency, where these are conversations I didn't think anybody wanted to hear or would listen to beyond my culture. White allies, this is what I have to say about white allyship. I've had so many white allies in my life, and people may be surprised to hear me say that, but the way that their allyship showed up was if someone said something that was inappropriate in a meeting, either directly to me or about Black people, they were whispering to me in the hallway, "Can you believe that was said?" Or they were saying something to me in the parking lot, or giving me a text or calling me. But when they were in this chair in that space and had the opportunity, they didn't say anything. And there's many reasons for that. Most of my white allies are women that I think of, and they may have been not had privilege in that space as a woman. So my advice is use privilege and your power in any space that you're in, and link arms with those around you. So often we let things go unsaid, or there's times when things have been said. And so those are what my allies did. But more often than not, in spaces when things inappropriately happen, people do downcast eyes and they would just look away. Or if something was said, they would just look at me as if, see if I was going to respond. So often in these spaces, the burden and the weight is left on the person from the marginalized community. And Kiona, you said it well, I'm very empowered, but it's interesting how these things, while I've seen them happen before, I don't ever expect them. I guess that's a good thing. So I'm taken aback. So sometimes in the moment, I'm quiet, not because I'm not empowered. Honestly, I'm trying to process the emotions and kind of like, did I just hear that? What just happened? And if someone were there to jump in and to say, I've got your back, it would be so much more. And in the same way that I hope I would do that for other communities. Right. I haven't always. If I'm honest, there's things that have been said about the LGBTQ community in my space, in my presence, and I've walked away and felt like that showed my disapproval, but I didn't in the moment say, hey, that's not all right, don't say that. And so I've been called upon to lean into being an ally in the spaces that I'm in as well, and I'm doing better and can always continue to learn. But that's how I see white allyship kind of showing up so far in my life. And so I ask white allies to use your voice in the space and any sphere of influence that you have. And it may feel uncomfortable at first, but you'll be surprised at how you model, and so many other people will join in and actually believe in you when you make the first step.
That's awesome.
Well, how do you handle white allyship, Kiona? You have so many steps, and how do you, I want to say, empower people to be white allies?
Yeah, I just, the three R's or 3 steps I talked about in the series last year, which is hard to believe that was last summer. Reflect, retain, and react, because, I need you to reflect. We need you to understand the humility, and to your point, this awakening that is evolving or that you've come to learn has been having, and it's been so systemic and understanding, right? Like now we're at a point where we need cultural etiquette, right? Tone, things that are sensitive, understanding, why Juneteenth or, is important, but also why maybe many people don't celebrate the 4th of July. So just, getting some of that basic understanding, as you mentioned and alluded to earlier, we both are human, but more so we do take responsibility for the spaces that we're in and the things that we do, and own our experiences, with also understanding we're learning and growing, and how we, with, for example, the LGBTQ community, even it's like, okay, I didn't know that, pronouns and all these little things that we have to learn, but empathizing as well, but reflecting, retaining your knowledge, retaining your growth, retaining ownership, retaining and owning that you might have to go back and apologize to somebody, and own and be and put pride down and bring humility up. And then after you acknowledge, reflection and retaining, now it's time to react, right? Now we find that third process and that step of, okay, it might look like you love animals. There's equity that needs to be fulfilled in, being a veterinarian. I have no idea, right? Everybody activates their activism in so many different little ways, in bigger ways as well. But what is impactful to you that you find that is a success for you to feel empowered, that you own that space? And I think those three things are always my go-to, and how I try to give my peers, white professionals in Kansas City, understanding in ways to proactively engage their spaces and moving forward, because it's different, Nicole, even from your peers and the conversations you have. My conversations are somewhat the same, but different, right? We're almost at a whole generation where, Tulsa, what we just experienced just this past summer, and then just having to go back, like, you were fortunate, your parents and your grandparents and it's like, we sat down and had those conversations, right? Like we had no choice. There was no Twitter, it was no Facebook, it was no Instagram. Now we're at this point where my generation, so many of these things are right at our fingertips, but yet we assume that we're learning and we know, and it's like, no, some of us don't, which is sad to say, but we've had, we have so much more access to things than we ever did before, and we don't know. And so I find myself in how do I kind of strike a balance of, as a young person, still learning and growing and hearing those shared lived experiences from people who deem worthy of actually going through or experiencing or still having, this generational different approach, but also understanding, okay, I have a responsibility to, somewhat pass down from what I've learned and what I've heard to other people, so they can understand that this is something that is not just my parents' generation, it's our generation too, because these are the next mayors, these are the next city council women and men, these are your next bosses, your managers, your executives, all those things that, 5 years from now, it's like, oh, we'll deal with it, but 5 years is around the corner. And so to kind of start cultivating some cultural etiquette amongst the next generation is so important when it comes to white allyship.
That is so true. And I just wanted to add one last thing, because you said so many good things. What I want to say to my friends, my white allies, the thing that you can most do is to speak. And I know that people are fearful of saying the wrong thing. Risk is real. And no one knows that better than communities of color. We're in a constant state of risk analysis with our decisions and our choices. And we don't want, and it's difficult to put ourselves out there, right? But what has happened more often than not, and Facebook shows it more than anything, and you've seen this, Kiona, I can post something about my son and it will just get so many likes or whatever. And I post something about what's happening in our community and it's crickets. And I know that people are fearful and they say, well, we don't know what to say and we don't want to say the wrong thing. I dare say the wrong thing is not saying anything. Even if you say, Nicole, I know you're hurting. I'm not sure what to say. Just wanted you to know I'm here. Just think of some simple statements like, I'm here for you. I'm listening. I'm learning. But when you act as if something isn't posted or something doesn't happen, that hurts in a way more than a misspoken word would, if that
Yeah.
makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And so acknowledgement is the start, and then of course doing your own work. But when someone is close to you in your life that's hurting in any area, you reach out to them. This is no different. And so that's what I really say to white allies. Even when you don't have the words, say that I'm not sure, I don't have the words, but say something.
That's good. That's really good. I have nothing else to say about white allyship. You just killed it.
You are killing it, sis.
Navigating white spaces, workplace culture. Okay.
Oh, Kiona, you have to share your stories because you have had what people see as such a full and rich resume and experiences. And from the time when we met, it's been 2 years ago to now, you have lived 2 lifetimes of work and all the things that you've accomplished, which is phenomenal to watch. So you have deep experiences in these things, because I hope you'll share the story that you shared in person about where you first, your entry point to where you are now, and the ways that you've navigated those spaces and the ways people have responded to you. You have some real nuggets that I think people will be surprised to hear and learn a lot from.
Yeah, for sure. For me, I think it's a very unique situation. My story is very unique, and just the evolution of my journey here in Kansas City, of those who have a privilege of knowing me personally, and just knowing the work in the community and things that I've been fortunate to do, not because I so destined saw myself doing just that, but really, spiritually, and having divine intervention that pushed me there. And when you see, out of college, right? Traditionally, the 9 to 5 is what we seek and what we want. And for me, it was, hey, I'm going to get a job, and then on in the alignment of that too, you're also sometimes, as with, formally coaching and jobs, you're maybe the first in your family to graduate. You're maybe the first, in your family to try to reach those goals and aspirations in your family, because you are the first to supersede and try to make those strides forward, and which is a whole nother mask within itself. But basically, making a long story short, we talk about always treating people with kindness, always treating people with respect. And it has been for me quite of a journey, because I grew up as Kiona Sinks, right? And not knowing the job that I had at the time would let me go and say, hey, we see no value. But me and you have our first event sold out in Kansas City, and then my personal life is drowning, right? And so I'm trying to figure out, like, how is all this happening at the time that it is? And honestly, being let go was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I was able to find empowerment and generational branding, and how to elevate a space with young professionals, and just showing up as, here, I'm Kiona Sinks. I'm not Kiona Sinks with the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. I'm not Kiona Sinks with the pharmacy. I'm just Kiona Sinks. And there's something to be said about activating self-worth and owning your brand, owning your space, owning who you are, intentionally becoming the poster child for what probably young professionals at this age in modern day era, we have to start looking at, and how to activate the spaces that we're in towards leaning in, growing, and making sure we're taking those strides outside of the workplace. And so the workplace for me, as was very untraditional, because after I got let go, now you have to put measures in place untraditionally, right? To try to figure out, how do you navigate building community, right? When you don't have a workplace that is providing that culture for you, so you can grow, so you can get those everyday anecdotal experiences that ultimately, as we know, cultivate your next professional step in your work career or work history. So it's just been for me a eye-opening experience to now look back 4 years ago, actually, around this time, to say, I haven't had a 9 to 5 until here recently. And that's what paid my bills. That's what activated me to do what I do. And, if you didn't catch, you didn't eat. So you can imagine, as personally, that was real. Like you say, risk is real. But that risk was ultimately rooted in blessings, and wouldn't take it back for anything. And through that, I've learned how to activate, how to own myself in white spaces in ways that I didn't foresee even happening. But now I can help other leaders such as yourself, how to make sure generationally we can put some things in place on top of traditional everyday, my job's my job, or, we measure these things, against everybody. But as the workforce changes, as young professional needs changes, as things continue to move and shift and grow, we're finding out, maybe that person who did social media in your company, they were pretty important this past year. Right. So it's just all these little things, and how actually I have a unique opportunity to actually shift empowerment amongst young leaders. And it's been pretty amazing to see. But through that, I had to go through some of that first, and it was very eye-opening.
You said so much, and I just have to pause and call into the space that you have persisted, and you embody authentic and empowered leadership. So I bet people right now are gasping, saying, "Wait, that's her first 9-to-5 since, and she's been without." You would never know that by the journey that you've led.
For sure.
And I think it was there are no accidents, and this was specifically the time that we needed to both look at. I mean, you're the intersectionality of gender, race, and age. And that you didn't wait for someone to pass you the mic. You unapologetically took the mic and shared it with others, but you made sure you amplified not only your experiences, but on behalf of your community. And so that has led to so many things that we've seen, and those same folks who let you go had to circle back. Did you share about that? You have to share about how they've circled back, because therein lies a story that I think you will continue to say from the main stage, but there is a message there that people really need to hear today.
Yeah, I think it boils down to, Nicole, we talk about, you do this work in board development and recruiting and helping retain and hire and referrals and references and follow-ups and introductions and all those things that help gets people the things that they need, because you have to have relationships to do that. And for me, I was on a opposite side of that, because I'm hired, I'm trying to learn this new role, and I'm trying to navigate white space simultaneously in a workplace and their culture, which is really traditionally really not the best. But, as we as Black people, what do? We make it work. We always analyze our day to day, and we put things in place that makes us successful internally, as even being oppressed in spaces that might not feel the best. And so in doing that, you're let go, and it's hurtful, because a lot is not just riding on the professional development, but also just day to day. Risk is risk, things that you have to activate in your personal life that are not met. And during that time, it was because they didn't think I was a good fit, and I didn't have the resume skills, hard skills on paper that we look at traditionally to determine whether someone is qualified for a role. But I think going back now in time, what we saw last year too, what we really saw was thought leadership, compassion, and relationship building. Because in COVID, when businesses were on the line, we didn't go to things we didn't know. We went to people who we know. And so for me, going outwardly, right, I'm let go. I've moved on. I have to figure out my life. And I just started as reputation and network equity, as I always say that term, network equity, and owning, the relationships and the stake ownership. And now reputation is starting to meet the name credential. But also, you meet some of those same people along the way who unfortunately didn't see your value and your worth when those things weren't prevalent, right? Those things are always evolving and always changing. But having the opportunity to meet them along the way, and kid you not, I save these emails, because now these emails are, we don't know what we were thinking. We are so sorry. And I don't know how we let you go, but we were not in our right frame of mind. And I think it's something to be said, the strides that we naturally do, that I embody, that I talk about now, and the sensitivity about workplace culture and how I felt, are the very same things that people now come to the realization that those were always important, right? They just weren't important at the time, and it came with the cost. And so it's very humbling, And I think it's more of a testimony, but for sure, those emails will definitely be saved in scrapbook at some point in life.
It has been beautiful to watch, and I hope people get this reference and it comes as it's intended, but it reminds me of Pretty Woman when they wouldn't let her shop.
Oh,
And then
yeah.
she shopped and they said, big mistake, huge. I feel like that's it. Kiona wasn't there and they're saying big mistake, huge, but I knew there would always be that moment that it would come back and that it was going to be maybe not on my timeline, but I had no doubt that it was going to come back. So I think those are powerful moments about who we overlook, who we deem as having value, and how we view what we think are those traditional skills on a resume, instead of looking at those attributes that are transferable skills and really build a culture and how we just how we acknowledge people. And there's many young professionals of color that are nodding and cheering and possibly crying because they're saying, yes, Kiona, that's my story. And they have experienced the same thing. So and I want people to know that it even happens to someone amazing like you, because we tend to think, not Kiona. No, absolutely. You're a part of the same narrative. We say we're not a monolithic community. We all have different experiences, but there's a collective narrative about some ways in which we're treated that I really want you to speak to. So thank you for that. That was awesome.
Yeah, and as we go to the next slide, I know we're coming up on about 45 minutes.
It goes so fast.
But I wanted you to talk about this. I will not comment on this because recruitment, retention, affinity bias, pipeline building, you do a lot of that. And I think Nicole just dropped. So we will go to slide 5 and piggyback the backwards until she comes back on the screen. For belonging and intersectionality and race and gender and age is such an important topic in all places of workspaces, and how we need to. You're back. We're gonna go.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. At least I got back quickly.
No, you're fine. We're gonna go back because I was gonna jump right into this until you pop back on.
Thank you. This is what you do when you technical difficulty, just jump in.
Yes, so, pipeline building, right? So you're big on recruitment, retention, affinity bias, pipeline building. You do this in coaching. Talk a lot about, right? It's not this reactionary, okay, Nicole, we're ready to change our board. We're ready to do it's not that easy, right? Because there already has to be somewhat of a foundation in the relationships built, and not that they can't happen and then you can't meet those metrics and those goals, but those things have to somewhat be a reality of conversation and structured in place to ultimately meet what we know as, okay, now we can just shoot the email and we can just get these things in place, and you're perfect at it. Talk about it.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to go kind of fast because I want to get to the rest of this. But what I see is people would always come to me in the recent past and say, who do you know? And Kiona's heard me say this so many times. And I would kind of look, and then I realized quickly the who do I know meant who do you know that looks like you and is of the same culture? Who's the same culture, professional level, etc. And it just was so off-putting after a while, because I would make this list of individuals because I know so many amazing people in the community. And there are plenty of people of color who can serve in these roles. And then those individuals would come back to me again. So let's say I gave them the list of some people to serve on board. When those terms were up, they would come back to me, and I think, I'm not the conduit to a whole community. And I realized they did not build a relationship. So I know that you do this. When you connect with other people, you give a name and you expect them to cultivate that relationship and build it as a ripple effect. What we do is we still largely live in segregated communities. I think most people who are watching today, if they look out their front door and they look to the house to the left or the right, or the apartment above or below them or beside them, they're going to see people who look very much like them in terms of their culture, socioeconomic status, as well as their education level. And the same thing happens when you go to work, places of worship, all the places that we occupy. And because of that, we're not interacting to meet people different than ourselves. I'm going to tell a truth that's an ugly truth, but it is a truth. I know that I'm selected for boards, opportunities, and other things because I have largely lived in white communities and its proximity. I am the Black person that people see. And I'm not trying to minimize the contributions that I give, because I hope I've stepped into those, and I think that I have. But I know that when they say, who should we have? They go, Nicole Jacob Silvey, because they've seen me at church, in the neighborhood, all of those things, right? And we have affinity bias to people we think are most like us. And the farther we get outside of the rings of Christianity, white, male, all of those things that we centered our community in, the further we get in terms of being a sense of recruited and being a sense of belonging. I even see this with affiliations with universities. I can be someplace and my husband will wear his KU jersey and I hear this rock chalk. I mean, we'll be out of town. And so we do this around so many things that when people are like us and we have something in common with them, we feel a safety and a security. Well, what that does is we just get people exactly like us. And then we look around and say, there's no diversity. So diversity has to be sought out in relationship building by looking at building out relationships outside of your community. It's as easy as that. And taking the time to get to know someone who's different than ourselves. It's easiest to talk with someone who, has a lot in common with us, but it's harder to reach out and learn about someone else's circumstance and story that may on the surface seem different than us. And I bring that up because I don't know how many times I've seen someone and I thought, oh, we probably don't have anything in common on the surface, but there's core experiences like parenting, just adulting when you're a young person, navigating education spaces or bills that are shared experiences that we can find some collective ground around those, that we're more alike than we are different. So that's what I share about pipeline building. So I do that strategically with companies, but I put the work on them. It's not the build it and they will come. It's what are you doing to reach out to other communities and not only reach out, but give a sense of belonging, which goes to the next slide.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes the Roundtable so special, because that is what the network equity that we both have built, and then jointly partnering together has this sense of belonging that facilitates itself naturally instead of feeling forced. So when we hosted the men's roundtable, when we hosted the women's roundtable, when we went to UMKC and keynoted for the young ladies, over 500 girls in a space, they felt that, right? They felt just our interactions. And like I said earlier, not perfect. And there are so many amazing people in our community who are facilitating this work in everyday spaces. That is not easy. It's not easy for us. Me and you go through our own stuff, and then we call people on the side and we're like, did this just happen? Like, I need a whole minute, So, but coming together, right, and having all of that kind of immersed in one non-affinity bias, to your point, it works wonders in ways that now a lot of people are starting to look outwardly, because we're seeking that belonging in ways that last year we missed, right? And so I think it is a refreshing perspective that so many people are longing and so desperately to have. And you said it so perfectly. I'm like, yep, couldn't say it like that, but awesome. Lastly, I think this is our last slide. Me and you talk about this a lot because we're from two different generations. So the whole intersectionality and how we're two different ages. Speak to that, Nicole, in terms of, I know I definitely can. And this is something that I still struggle with every single day, about advocating for diversity is not just reflected in, Black and white and Hispanic and Latino and LGBTQ and all these other sector spaces of community, but also in age, right? Because young people now, passing the torch, not necessarily passing the torch, but I always talk about too, if you're going to ask. So if I'm 26 and I'm going to ask, I need to be ready for that, right? So it works both ways, but there's still just this a bias in terms of just, superseding and overlooking. And I think there's something to be said about why me and you are able to facilitate such spaces together that seems so natural.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. This is really your area. The brief things that I'll say is, when we really create a community of belonging that's intergenerational, it's the idea that we're all lifelong learners, and that just because you have more years on this earth doesn't mean that you have solely greater experience, knowledge, and everything. It's not the belief that whoever's oldest in the space has the most knowledge. And that is humbling, but a way that I don't know where I got that mindset from. Mentors and my parents must have taught that to me early on. But what it's saying is that people show up in spaces and we can mutually learn. It isn't this sense of wait your turn. And I've even gotten that, even my age at 50, I get that wait your turn, that there's still, like we talk about this passing the torch. And I say this to you all the time, that I've seen people who say they're passing the torch, but it's this tug of war. It's like, wait, no, but don't, I just wait your turn. And when I'm gone, and instead of, what if we together leveraged our talents and our abilities and strengths around these topics, wouldn't we be further along? I dare say we'd be farther along in gender equity and definitely racial equity if we linked arms instead of having a sense of competition, a sense of she has the spotlight or why her and why not me. All of these things that we bring into the space, which are really a piece of internalized sexism and internalized racism and oppression. Absolutely, internalized oppression. We live it out, right? And so it's difficult to. Yeah, we can say it together. It's difficult to be the people who are also fighting for anti-racism work at the same time maybe perpetuating internalized oppression. And therein lies so much difficulties. But you speak about the ways in which you think intersectionality plays out, especially, we don't speak a lot about age. And I think there's a lot that you share about that that's really powerful and it's taught me a lot.
Yeah, no, I just start with just, those meetings and taking initiative, right? So if I'm a young person in the city and I'm, seeking spaces and validation to understand and learn, just to get to know Nicole, that comes from me, right? I need to reach out. I need to say, hey, my name is such and such. Or if you don't feel comfortable doing that, identifying somebody in your space, such as another mentor, because we all have more than one mentor, I hope, right? To try to, help steer us along the way, but having that access. So that's number one, creating the relationship and opening the lines. But it is difficult, right? Because I've done that. That's how I felt like I had to kind of, it was what was important for me, right, to facilitate and initiate those relationships and those meetings, and asking for nothing, right, and simply seeking community and getting to know other people prior to like name recognition didn't matter, right? I just saw that person for them. And I think that is a special trait. I think God gave that to me. I'm not sure. But I think it has paid me some deviance. And now, right, you building trust, now you're able to prove and work and others identify your value so you can take ownership for that in your space. And I think sometimes, to your point, Nicole, about playing this tug of war, because ultimately, traditionally, correct me if I'm wrong, we've had to be verified or solidified in our spaces from someone else, right? Black or white, right? Oh, let me do the introduction, or let me connect you with. So, when you take that away and when you evoke and initiate and take initiation in those spaces, is what I talk to young professionals about all the time in this kind of different sector. It takes away, right, just naturally, not even trying to like kick anything off. It just naturally takes away some of that traditional introductory, culturally relationship building in ways that we just don't have to facilitate that way anymore, right? So I think naturally it looks as if, right, like you've been here for 5 minutes and you're doing everything. Well, yeah, right. Because it took you 5 hours. So it should take me 5 minutes. And then I hope for the next girl, it takes her 5 seconds. So there's so many different, layered, as we talk about every single day. There's so many different layered activations on how generationally, when we start looking at this broader messaging, it all plays a part into relationship building. I mean, you can't take one away from the other and separate them and not, own that. And I think that's truly been my experience. And some days are better than most because that is a natural state. I am going to be second guessed because I'm 26. I am going to be more questioned because of my age and because, made assumptions of, we had those conversations with this event in person 2 weeks ago with Asia and Mallory about, if you're a woman and you're starting businesses and you go to a predominantly male space, well, you're not going to be taken as seriously, right? But then layered on top of that is we're young people. We're doing things in a way that we starting businesses at 20. Like that ain't, that was not a time where it was like you didn't do certain things. You got your good job, you went to college. This is how we did things. This is how we orchestrated them. So I think times are changing and we're breaking strides. But if you're breaking those strides, with that comes so much that you didn't ask for. And that is very true because it's a lot to funnel through and to talk about. But definitely like talking to this amongst like older people, it sinks. But when I just said what I said in a room full of like 25 younger, like late 20s, everybody's like, yep, say less, like already know. And so that tells me that, okay, I'm not crazy. This is resonating with people across communities, and it's quite refreshing, but also challenging too, as we try to balance this, intergenerational approach to, I'm not saying I know everything, but let me just share this with you so you can have some insight on why I made this decision versus you assuming that I didn't care or I don't, need your advice or I didn't think about X, Y, and Z. So.
Yeah, I find it so interesting because many of the people who are pushing back really strongly in this space are some of the same people who raised those that are in your generation. So we've raised people to be empowered and authentic and to push and to disrupt. But when they do it in the spaces we're in, we're like, oh, but not here. So I think it's just talking about how we value people, and valuing someone shouldn't have to be earned. Someone should be valued for who they are as they show up in a space just because of their humanity, right? And so I think when we get to that place, we'll see some movement. But right now, it's a bit of a proving your worth that you're bumping up against. So I love that.
Absolutely.
I think we only have a few more minutes. We've talked this whole time.
The whole time. Give us, it's too much. We're just going to email these slides. Thank you all so much for tuning in with us, watching us, listening to this facilitation brought to you by Flexy. We're super excited. Nicole and I have, what's our next event, Nicole? It's
July 28th?
July. How am I forgetting? July 28th.
I know.
Doors open at 4:30 with some wine. Tickets are on our Facebook page, the Roundtable. Nicole and I on all social medias as well. You can find me at just Kiona Sinks, and Nicole is in Silvey, Casey.
Yes.
Yep, I got it.
I am going to share all of the links in the chat, as well as I'm going to put them up on the screen right now. You can screenshot this, screenshot the chat, whatever you would like. Those are everyone's social handles. And while that is up, I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to let you guys know what Flexy does in case you are unaware of that. We are a fitness company that primarily does fitness. We go to apartment complexes, hotels, office buildings, all of those things, and we bring fitness, wellness to these places. It seems random to a lot of people that we've done a couple of events like this now, but this ties in so closely with the mental health of the community as well. And that's why we find it to be so important. So we wanted to make sure that we are actively working in this space as well. And we wanted to pick the best people that we knew to help us do that. And that is why, of course, we had to have Nicole and Kiona on. So yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us. And we will also share the link to your guys' next event with this video as well. And we can't wait to have more conversations with you guys soon.
Thank
you all so much. Mallory just popped out.
I love it.
So much for having us. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see those who came to Be the Good in person when they get this information. And those who watch this today will meet Nicole and I July 28th at 4:30 p.m., which is going to be a treat. Tickets are limited, so please get them while they're available. And we hope to see everybody soon.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you all so much.
Be the good. Bye.
Bye.